Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Don't Risk It podcast presented by VFIS Client Risk Solutions. This program focuses on the exposures our clients frequently encounter and discusses the potential solutions to help reduce these exposures. I'm your host, Chris Rogers with VFIS Client Risk Solutions, and today marks a special occasion for the Don't Risk It podcast. This is our 100th episode and is a significant milestone for the team, an achievement we're very proud of and would not be possible without our listeners. We want to thank you for being a part of the podcast. Also, I want to thank all of the guests that have been on the program, as well as our marketing department and education and training division for all they've done in making this podcast possible. Joining me on the program today are Mike Baker, Blair Tyndall, and Dave Bradley from the Client Risk Solutions team. They're here to discuss the 5 most common recommendations made by the Client Risk Solutions team during our risk consulting meetings. Gentlemen, I want to thank you for joining me today, and I appreciate your time.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
So, Blair, can you explain the risk recommendation process to our audience?
Sure, Chris. Just to give you a little insight into what our team, one of the things that our team actually does is we make on-site visits with our customers to talk about risk reduction. We do what we call a risk assessment. And based out of those conversations, at times we make recommendations to our customers to improve their risk management and improve the overall safety of the organization. So what we have here today is the 5 most common things that we make recommendations for to our customers during our on-site visits.
So it looks like, looking through this list, that the top 3 recommendations are related to fleet safety, which kind of echoes how important vehicle safety and vehicle training is. Can you kind of walk us through the top recommendation in that area?
Chris, I'll lead it off with the number 1, and that happens to be, I guess everybody could kind of guess this one. It's ongoing driver training. So a lot of the organizations we go out and consult with and go over their operations and their training programs, most of them do a really good job of onboarding the new driver or bringing them into play with some EVDT, as we call it, emergency vehicle driver training. And then that includes some form of some form of a behind the wheel observation or evaluation by some of the seasoned or leadership within the organization. And then all that takes place before they're released. But what we fail in a lot of these organizations is once you've kind of received that initial training and privilege to drive for an emergency response, that's where the training kind of ends. And it's unfortunate because a lot of organizations should implement an ongoing component in order to reduce the complacency, obviously, of some of those drivers who become more seasoned and feel that they have the operation is pretty much just like driving a personal vehicle, and they get really confident and sometimes a little too confident and fail to observe some of the things that can happen with some of these larger vehicles on the roadway. So what we asked organizations to do is every year to put out some form of a awareness level training. It could be as simple as a 20-minute video. It could be a driver proficiency checklist or just any number of things to evaluate those drivers and make sure that they're operating the ways that the leadership team wants them to be operating that vehicle behind the wheel. So that is done annually and with a minimum of probably a full-blown driver training course every 3 to 5 years is what we would like to see. But again, it's up to the organization depending on call volume and experience of those operators.
Dave, go ahead.
Just to tag on to what Mike said, you think about the ongoing driver training and where the focus should be. NFPA gives us some really good guidelines on how often ongoing driver training should be, and many states now require EMS ongoing driver training as part of their certification process. But you look at where are the major issues, where's frequency and where's severity, and those can be looked at in your own organization if when you track your losses. So what's your most frequent? For us at VFIS, it's hitting things that aren't moving while we're going forward, and then the severity, the intersections, but you can also look at national issues, and just addressing those issues that are most frequent and most severe is probably one of the most important things for organizations to think about.
Blair, I'll ask this next question with you. One of the second most common recommendation I think that I see is EVRS, or Emergency Vehicle Response Guidelines. Can you kind of go into that avenue and talk about that?
Yes, I'd be glad to, Chris. EVRS guidelines and all the acronyms that have been used throughout the years, SOPs, but most people are using the guidelines now, or SOGs. So, a detailed document that's very specific to vehicle operations during an emergency response. And really then followed up with other operational opportunities that the vehicle is doing in non-emergency response. So we encourage and recommend our customers to have those documented, written down, that they are reviewed regularly and that they're updated as needed. And this gives a tone that the leadership of the organization has documented how they want this to be done, and it also gives the personnel inside of the organization kind of a roadmap to go by. So a lot of the things, backing up to what Dave usually just said, actually, some of the things that we like to see and be included in that is intersection practices. Defining what's a controlled intersection, what's an uncontrolled intersection, how do we approach red lights, how do we approach green lights, how do we approach any intersection, how are different types of intersections approached, is it a T intersection, is it a four-way, all of those things need to be documented inside of these EVRS guidelines. Rollover prevention, what does the agency expect and document as far as rollovers are concerned? What kind of training do we do should be documented in these guidelines as well. How do we respond as vehicle operators during what could potentially be a rollover situation, and how do we regain control of that vehicle? Obviously, one of the big ones, and Dave alluded to it earlier, is hitting things that are not moving, striking fixed objects. So backing practices is one that is really huge. We really encourage that policy to be in place in all organizations. And how do we handle backing if there's no one on the truck? Well, we fall back if there's only one operator to our circle of safety. So all of that stuff needs to be documented inside of those guidelines. And then the final kind of big bullet point that we look at with EVRS guidelines is the use of emergency lights and sirens. When are we expected to be running emergency traffic? Is it necessary all the time? Can we get to the place safer without using lights and sirens? Or when should we be using lights and sirens? And then what does the local laws say in each one of the states that we operate in, but specifically in your state of operation, what do the laws say in that state about how to use those lights and sirens? Because each state has different laws pertaining to what the requirements are for those.
So before we move on to the third recommendation, can someone talk about the importance of following what we have if it's in writing, to make sure that we're training to that and following those guidelines? Because if we don't, what we do in practice becomes the policy versus what is written. So can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Absolutely, Chris, and that's an awesome point that organizations really need to think about. You can have everything perfectly in writing, but if you haven't educated your staff to what the expectation is, and then they don't follow that expectation, that can have, if an untoward event happens, that can have a bad impact on the organization, because what's written, what was taught, was not necessarily done, or vice versa. We all talk to organizations that think, well, the more I put in writing, the more at risk I am. And that's truly it's not a truth. It's important to have these things, as Blair pointed out, comprehensive and written and reviewed with the staff, even requiring a sign-off and an annual review as part of ongoing driver training. If we switch back to that, it's just important to make sure those pieces are understood and followed by everybody.
I think Dave hit it right on the head there. The most important part out of these two recommendations, both driver training as well as guidelines, is do as it's written or do as you're trained. If you do those two things, you're going to go a long way towards reducing the risk of your organization. So a lot of the places we get into, what you'll find out is day two, all of the training and all of the guidelines go on a shelf or out the window. And next thing you know, you're one of those organizations that can potentially or have a higher chance or opportunity of loss.
Dave, I'm going to call you back to the mic for this next question on the third recommendation, which is MVRs. Can you talk about motor vehicle records and why they're important, why we make that recommendation?
Absolutely, Chris. And to boil it down to just a few words, know your drivers. If you're an organization that doesn't do motor vehicle record checks or MVRs, you don't know your drivers. Yes, you may say you live in a small town and you know what everybody does and when they're pulled over, but truly it does not protect you unless you take the time to understand how those are done. And what we recommend is you do an initial driver training, Chris, you do an initial MVR check on new drivers before they even enter the driver training program. And then we recommend annual ongoing motor vehicle record checks just to, again, know your drivers. So initial and then ongoing or annual. Another thing that we've added in our recommendations is that anytime a person has a moving violation or any action against their driver license, the policies stipulate that they must report that to leadership within a given number of days, and that's up to the organization to identify. And most important, or not most important, but another important point is there's got to be evaluation criteria, so everyone is treated exactly the same. And so everybody who has moving violations, so many moving violations, is treated the same. Obviously, the big ticket items, the DUI, the leaving the scene of an accident, there's typically state mandates that tell you when they can or when they can't drive. The other thing to keep in mind with MVRs, we have a lot of organizations that are large or that sit near state lines. So it's important to not only do your state, but if you hire somebody or they volunteer from another state, it's important to get that state's MVR also so you have a clear picture of your drivers.
Good points, Dave. Everything. I just wanted to remind our listeners, as I was sitting here listening to us cover these topics, the first three ones that we've all talked about are have to do with vehicle operations. So we got to circle back. Not that the other two are not important, but the three most ones that we see that we have to recommend to our customers have to do with vehicle operations. So that should shed some light on just how important and how risky our vehicle operations are.
And Blair, great point. And I wanted to add one more thing that just came to mind under MVRs. This is not just for your emergency vehicle operators. This is for anybody who drives a company vehicle. So personal vehicle, maintenance, wheelchair van, all of those people should have, anybody who drives a company vehicle or an agency vehicle should be part of the MVR process.
Yeah, if someone has 7 moving citations in their personally owned vehicle, they're probably going to not drive a vehicle that they don't own and they're not responsible for paying for. They're not going to drive it any safer. So it's a very, very good insight onto their driving practices. So we've talked about the top 3 on the vehicle side. Now we're going to move on to one that's on the medical side, and that's patient handling. Mike, I'll ask this question of you. Can you talk about patient handling and the reasons that we make that recommendation?
Yeah, Chris, this is probably one of the bigger, like you say, the non-auto side of the coin or that side of the house. But patient handling is huge from the aspect of when you think back to your initial training as an EMT or a paramedic and the amount of time that you spent pertaining to actually lifting and maneuvering patients just seems very small in comparison to all of the medical training. Well, when it comes to the exposure from a risk standpoint, it's actually quite the reverse. Is a lot of your exposure for a professional liability claim is going to be lifting and maneuvering that patient. Patient drops or stand pivot moves and all those things are probably at least, I'm going to say, just shy of 50% of the claims that we see in the VFIS professional liability arena. So that's huge when you come to trying to eliminate a certain type of risk in your organization. So many of the organizations we go out to, they try to attack this, but it seems like the simplest of tasks, right? Moving a patient seems like, wow, this is simple. It doesn't take a whole lot of practice or understanding to make this safe. Well, there's some tips and tricks that are out there that are in some of our training programs, videos, and resources that I think oftentimes get overlooked and are a huge root cause to these incidents which we see come across the claim side of the house. So I encourage organizations to take a deep look at the initial and ongoing patient handling training. Again, it shouldn't be just a once and done you kind of went through the program and you're good to go. There's, again, just like driver training, there's a complacency issue I think that exists in this particular type of claim. And in order to stay ahead of that, you have to obviously do some retraining and just some proficiency analysis. So one of the common things that's come into the industry lately, probably when I say lately, I'm dating myself, but in the last 10 years or so, is the use of shoulder straps. It's becoming more and more normal practice in the industry, but it's really taken a long time to curve that and make that happen. But again, if your organization is missing some of the routine equipment or has altered the equipment in any way, those practices should cease immediately. And you should look at what you need to do to bring that equipment up to standards as it was delivered by the manufacturer.
Mike, all of those are great things. And I just wanted to reemphasize one point that we hear frequently from a lot of our EMS customers is that they count their patient lift and handling training as time spent with the manufacturer of the stretcher or the manufacturer of the cot or the stair chair or whatever. That is great training. Your staff members need to be familiar with that equipment, and the actual manufacturer representative needs to be there to show you how to properly operate that equipment, but we shouldn't let that take the place of having our own patient lifting and handling training. So that's just a note to make sure you follow up with that training is important, but however, it may not be sufficient for proper patient lifting and handling training.
So Blair, can you go into some of the fidelity practices? That's the fifth recommendations that we talked about to give some insight so our clients can be better protected from that area.
Yes, Chris. Very good question, and we see this a lot in all volunteer organizations as well as combination departments, right on up to very large full career staffed organizations. Fidelity practices or financial procedures or whatever the buzzword is that you need to have. We all need to remember that in some shape, form, or fashion, we're funded by taxpayer dollars or we're funded by donations, or in a lot of cases, we have customers that are still doing a lot of fundraising to meet the needs of their budget. So fidelity practices are really important. First of all, it's really important to have your fidelity practices documented so that they can be handed on to the next appropriate person in the organization should that person become unavailable or resign. For example, if you have a treasurer in a department, we see sometimes our organizations that have had the same treasurer for 20 years, and that's great. But if something happens to that treasurer, there needs to be a backup to the backup. So we need to document what procedures we're going to use, how we're going to look after our finances, and that way we can also be responsible to the public because it's their money. And if they come and look at what we're doing as an organization, we need to have a comprehensive plan available to be able to hand to them. So some of the things inside of that, reconciling accounts regularly, like on a monthly basis at a minimum, the use of corporate credit cards, having guidelines for how those cards are used, what the spending limits are, who has that card, what is approved to be purchased, what different levels of the organization are able to access those finances without having to ask anybody else. Does it require approval from someone up the ladder? Does it require approval from the board of directors and so on? Also, a very good idea is to have an annual external audit. Carry it to a third party, certified public accountant or someone else, even if it's the funding agency. So if the county's funding you through tax money, let the county do an audit so that everybody has a second and third set of eyes looking at this particular transactions. So very important to have those fidelity, to have a succession plan that everybody knows how this works and that going forward they can understand what needs to be done in case something happens.
So are there any resources or anything that VFIS has that can help our clients? We obviously just mentioned 3 lines of coverage with vehicle, medical, and then general liability. Are there any resources that we have that we can help our clients out in these areas?
Chris, there's a bunch of stuff that's available both through VFIS.com for the training videos that are available to all of our clients at free at no charge. So you can simply call in to us at 1-800-233-1957, ask for the Education and Training Division, and they'll be more than happy to suit you up with some of the training videos to attract some of these driving things that are out there. Then there's also available on responderhelp.com is a bunch of bulletin documents, manager risk bulletins that we have both pertaining to actually all 5 of these categories have a risk document on them, because these are obviously our more severe or our more frequent type exposures that we encounter from both a claim as well as a recommendation basis for when we go out and consult with some of our clients. So again, there's resources available, responderhelp.com, VFIS.com, or you can feel free to call in and talk to one of us here in the office, and we'd be more than happy to help you on a one-on-one basis.
Well, gentlemen, it was a pleasure talking with you as always. I thank you for summarizing this information for our clients. I know we have these conversations with the ones that we get to meet, but hopefully some clients that we haven't met with yet can glean some information from this and help their organization move forward. So thank you for your time.
You bet, Chris. Thanks.
Thank you for having us, Chris.
Always a good talk.
And I want to thank you for listening to the program and for your interest in VFIS safety resources. I want to thank our guests Mike Baker, Blair Tyndall, and Dave Bradley once again for their time and information. Please consider subscribing to our program to stay up to date on new content releases. Also, if you like what you've heard, please consider leaving a review below. For more information about the many resources available from VFIS, please visit VFIS.com. And to submit ideas for future discussions, please reach out by email on VFISriskcontrol@VFIS.com. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day. The views, information, or opinions expressed during this program are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of Gladfelter Insurance Group, VFIS, and its employees.